Welcome back to the Illumination Lectures, and today we're going to discuss the discovery of the biblical Jesus in the historical record. And yes, that can be done. And again, this is taken from my book, Jesus, King of Edessa, which is, as I said before, is a 600-page opus that transforms the gospel story into real history. There are no bells and spells in there, just reason and rationality. So, where have we got so far in this lecture series? Well, in previous lectures, we've seen that the leader of the Jewish revolt was called Jesus of Gamala, who came from Galilee. Or he was called Monobazus or Izates of the Adiabeni, if you remember them. Sometimes he was called Bar Kamza. That came from the Hukok mosaic. And then they were also called the Babylonian Jews, or sometimes the fourth sect of Judaism, the Nazarenes. And so we have a number of names for this leader of the Jewish revolt. Plus, I've said that the biblical Jesus was indeed the leader of the Jewish revolt himself, because there are so many connections with this event within the biblical gospel stories. And so another name for this leader might be Jesus of Galilee, which is a very similar name to Jesus of Gamala, who came from Galilee. And as we saw in a previous lecture, Jesus of Gamala married Mary Magdalene, and we know that because the Talmud says so. And you can see the great similarity between these supposedly two separate stories. But none of these names that we've just looked at just now, none of these names or titles for this leader mention Edessa, that important city up in northern Syria. And with good reason, I suppose, because Edessa has been deliberately deleted from history by Josephus Flavius on the orders of Emperor Vespasian, so that you don't know who this monarchy really are. And they were deleted for two main reasons. Firstly, because the Edessans started the Jewish revolt. We have that from Josephus Flavius, who says so. And so Rome wanted to delete these rebels from history to prevent further revolts in the Roman Empire. And secondly, they were deleted because the Edessans were too closely connected to what became the biblical story. And so the subsequent Catholic Church continued this cover-up. And so the centennial cover-up of Edessa became the millennial cover-up of Edessa. And that has continued right up until the current time. So let's look at the Edessan monarchy in some more detail then. Now, the founding father of the Edessan monarchy, as far as my books actually say, was King Abgarus Okama V, who you might not have heard of, but here is a coin of Abgarus. And the legend is in Greek, and it says Abgarus Basileus, which means King Abgarus. And these are from a later era, but all of the Edessan monarchs wore the same royal regalia for more than 2 centuries. And so this image is representative of what these monarchs would have looked like in the 1st century. And this second coin is perhaps the finest in circulation. And as you can see, these are real monarchs with a real capital city and real coins, giving us real historical events. And note on this coin the traditional straight nose of the Edessan monarchs. The Roman emperors, which are also depicted on some of these coins, are not depicted in the same fashion at all. Notice all the royal crown of the Edessans and the diadema headband. You can perhaps see the tassels of the headband just behind his neck there. And again, the legend is in Greek on this coin, and it says Abgarus Basileus, King Abgarus. Well, now we can probably see why the nicknames for the leader of the Jewish revolt were coined. Remember, we've just been through this, that the pseudonyms given for the leaders of the Jewish revolt included the titles Gamala and Kamsa. And yet most Talmudic nicknames are a simple play on words. So we're just looking for a simple play on words here. And in this case, I think Gamala and Kamsa were both derived from Karma, which was the title of King Abgarus o Karma. And so, well, this is important because it confirms that all of these names refer to this same monarch and the same monarchy. So they refer to King Abgarus, who was the founding father of the kings of Edessa. And some modern historians will say that Abgarus o Karma means Abgarus the Black. But this doesn't refer to black skin, as is often said. It refers to Cam, the original name for Egypt. So Abgarus o Karma means Abgarus of Egypt, which is correct because King Abgarus was descended from Queen Cleopatra VII, as we saw in Lecture 1. Do tune into that lecture because it's very interesting and it shows the ancestry of this particular monarchy. So King Abgarus had two sons in the 1st century, and they were King Manu V and King Manu VI. And here is a coin of one of those monarchs. As you can see, it's a little bit rougher than the previous ones because this is an early coin. Some historians have said that this coin is from the 2nd century, but since it's of such poor quality and the legend is written in Aramaic, it is highly likely to be an original 1st century coin. And thus it will be a coin of King Manu V or the 6th. And the legend on this one is in Aramaic, as I say, and it reads Manu Malik, or King Manu. So we know who this particular king was. And we'll come across this particular king later in this lecture. So the sons of King Abgarus of Edessa were called Manu. But Josephus has a different name for them, and he calls these sons Isates and Monobazus. And Monobazus, as we've seen before, is a Greek title. It's a bastardized Greek title, meaning Monobasileus, the only king. While Isates is said to mean angel or divine being. But as I said before, it's probably actually Aramaic for strong horse, and therefore it's the same as the Greek Hippocrates. Remember that Mesopotamia used to speak Greek until probably until about the 1st century BC, and then the lingua franca, the common language of Mesopotamia, slowly turned into Aramaic due to the Parthian invasion of the Greek Middle East. So Isates could be an Aramaic translation of a Greek name. And this Edessan monarchy is intimately connected to the biblical story. As we saw in the last lecture, Saul, that's St. Paul, was an ambassador of Edessa. Yes, this is how closely linked this monarchy is to the biblical story. And then we come to the story of Addai in a manuscript known as the Doctrine of Addai. And I don't suppose you've read about this in Sunday school, but the Doctrine of Addai dates from the 3rd or the 4th century AD. And we know this because one version was written by Eusebius, and also because it contains a story of Queen Helena's tour of Judea. And this is Queen Helena of Constantine. And she was touring Judea looking for the history of Jesus. the biblical Jesus and the true cross. But personally, I think that this tour by Helena of Constantine is actually a masquerade. It's a copy of the tour of Judea by Queen Helena of Edessa in the 1st century. Thus, the later story of Helena of Constantine, looking for the history of Jesus in Judea, was designed to conceal the earlier tour by Helena of Edessa, who was looking for the history of her son, King Manu, in Judea. And what better way of concealing this ancient history? You don't deny that it happened. You just say that, oh, well, that Helena was Helena of Constantine. And suddenly, the earlier Helena disappears from history. And this is probably why you haven't heard of the earlier Helena of Edessa. And if this is true, then the Doctrine of Addai could be a much earlier manuscript. It could be from the 1st century. And it's an interesting story, which is very pertinent to this research because it tells us about letters and ambassadors being sent between the biblical Jesus and Edessa. Yes, according to this manuscript, Jesus was writing to King Abgarus of Edessa in the 1st century. And the Doctrine of Addai says, in the year 343 of the Greeks, which is about AD 32, and in the reign of Emperor Tiberius, on the 12th day of Keshvan, King Abgar-o-Kama sent Marehab and Shamshagram and Hanan, the record keeper, to the city which is called Eleutheropolis, near Jerusalem, to the honoured Sabinus, son of Eustorigus, the governor of Syria and Mesopotamia. Note the detail here. There's none of the sort of vagueness of the gospel stories. We don't have to invoke a 40-year period of oral transmission to explain this vagueness, because Judea was supposedly illiterate, as many historians say. But of course, Judea was not illiterate. I mean, you've only got to read the erudite and comprehensive works of Josephus to see that. And this story by the Doctrine of Addai is in the same vein as Josephus. It's very detailed. It has a lot of real history in it. So anyway, ambassadors are being sent from Edessa to Jerusalem in the 1st century to see the Roman governor. But the story continues, and it says, when they entered Jerusalem, they saw Christ, which means the king, and they rejoiced. But they also saw the Jews who were standing in groups and considering what they should do about him, for they were disturbed to see that a multitude of people followed him. The envoys of Edessa were in Jerusalem for 10 days, and Hanan wrote down everything which he saw that Jesus did. Eventually they departed and came back to Edessa and entered into the presence of Abgar the king. So you see the close relations that probably existed between Edessa and Judea in the 1st century. Now, theologians will often say that this story is apocryphal, it's fictional. But I think that's mainly because it contains too many problems for the Christian creed. But we've already seen the many links, the many close links that exist between Edessa and the biblical story. So this manuscript is just a continuation of what we already know. Anyway, King Abgarus was impressed with the reports about this political and spiritual leader called Jesus. And so he wrote to him, mostly about a cure for leprosy, but other things as well. And so there were many letters exchanged between King Abgarus and Jesus down in Judea. And this is what the Doctrine of Addai says. It says, King Abgar-o-Kama wanted to pass over and go to Judea to see with his own eyes all that Jesus was doing. But he was not able to pass through the country of the Romans. And so he wrote a letter and sent it to Jesus by the hand of Hanan, the keeper of the archives. Hanan went forth from Edessa on the 14th day of Adar and entered Jerusalem on the 12th day of Nisan. And he found Jesus at the house of Gamaliel, the chief priest of the Jews. Note the great detail once more. Great historical detail and chronological details. And most of this is historically correct. It says that King Abgarus of Edessa could not travel to Jerusalem. Well, that is probably correct because Procopius, he is a Roman historian, says that the Romans had kept King Abgarus as a hostage in Rome for 7 years in order to ensure the fidelity of the Edessans. And so it's likely that the Romans didn't fully trust King Abgarus, and so he was subject to travel restrictions to prevent him stirring up trouble in Judea. And the passage also says that Jesus was found at the house of Gamaliel. And this is the Gospel Gamaliel from Acts 5:34. He's the aristocrat and member of the Sanhedrin who defended the disciples against charges of heresy. And he was also probably the Gamaliel who was the tutor to Saul, St. Paul. So again, we see the many connections here between Edessa and the gospel story, and that the doctrine of Addai is probably historically correct in a lot of what it says. So Hanan, who was now in Jerusalem visiting Jesus, made a portrait of Jesus to show to King Abgarus. And here is an image from an ancient manuscript showing Jesus giving his portrait to Hanan. And this portrait was probably the Mandilion, a name which may mean handkerchief. We're not sure about that, but it may mean handkerchief. And this was probably one and the same as the veil of Veronica. Now, the Veronica image was said to be miraculous, whereas Hanan's portrait was a painting made with the choicest of pigments, as the document says. I think one version of the doctrine of Addai says it was miraculous. But anyway, we have a painting and we have a miraculous image. And here is King Abgarus of Edessa receiving the painting of Jesus from Hanan. And this is a modern image. This comes from Our Lady of Victory's Church in Paterson, New Jersey. And it's quite a wonderful and evocative stained glass window, isn't it? Nice to see new modern stained glass windows being produced that of such fine quality. And here again is King Abgarus of Edessa holding up this same portrait, or the miraculous Mandilion. And this again is another modern image. This comes from a Russian cathedral. And so this story of the doctrine of Addai is still recognized and venerated in certain Christian denominations. But of course, we don't have this portrait anymore, and the story is often said to be apocryphal. But within the doctrine of Addai, it is said that the portrait was hidden in the walls of Edessa in the 1st century. And it stayed there until Khosrow II of Persia discovered it in the 7th century. And so then it remained in the hands of the Saracens for 300 years until Emperor Lecapenus purchased it in the 10th century. And here is the Mandilion arriving back in Constantinople in the 10th century AD. And this is taken from the manuscript of Johannes Stylites, or John the Stylite. It comes from the National Library of Madrid, this particular one. Interestingly, this particular manuscript was preserved in the Chronicle of Zuchnin, which is important in this research because the Chronicle of Zuchnin is one of the few chronicles that records the history of Edessa. And of course, I use that quite a lot in my books. And viewers might ask, actually, what is a stylite? Well, here is a stylite. A stylite is a hermit who sat on the top of a pillar for the whole of his life. And pilgrims used to come and give offerings, which were pulled up on ropes to the top of the pillar. Although I dare say that the stylite probably came down again when nobody was looking. Otherwise he would be stuck there for the whole of his life. But these stylites were very popular in Eastern Christian churches. And here are some photos I took of very early stylite pillars. This particular one comes from Antioch Orontes. It's on the shores of the Mediterranean. And it comes from a monastery just to the south of Antioch. And the stylite pillar is that base of the pillar you can see right in the center of the photo there. And this is the second one. This comes from the Haran Basilica, which lies just to the south of Edessa. And you can see the stylite, the base of the stylite pillar, in that octagonal room just inside the basilica there. And so this form of devotion was very popular in the East, and it was, we don't quite know why they used to do this, but it's possibly linked to the Priapus idol of Queen Maca Tamar. If you remember, that was a subject that was covered in the last lecture. So where were we? Oh yes, we were looking at letters and ambassadors being sent from Edessa to Judea to see the Roman governor and to see Jesus, of course. And this is a very similar story to the one we saw of Saul Josephus, St. Paul, who was sent from Edessa to Judea in AD 47. And he went there with famine relief money because there was a famine in Judea at the time. And I say that these two stories document the same event. But there are different dates here. The Doctrine of Addai says that this occurred in the time of Emperor Tiberius, who reigned from AD 14 to AD 37, and not in the time of Emperor Claudius. But it had to say this to conform to the biblical chronology. So is that earlier date correct? Well, like most of these early texts, there seems to be a gaping hole in the chronology here. Because although the name of the emperor agrees with the biblical chronology, the name of the Roman governor of Syria in the same text does not. And in the text, he's being called either Sabinus, son of Eustorigus, or Marinus, son of Sterog. But this is not correct, because the three governors who reigned during the time of Tiberius were Lucius Lamia, Lucius Flaccus, and Lucius Vitellius. So who was this Marinus Sabinus character? Well, after much research, I found that there was a Roman governor of Syria who was the primary student of Masurius Sabinus. And he took over the Sabinian school of law in the 1st century. So we appear to have found our Marinus Sabinus. And he was actually called Cassius Longinus. And he was the, as I said, the leader of the Masurius Sabinus school of law. Now, there is only one problem with this identification, and that's that Cassius Longinus was the governor of Syria in AD 45 to AD 49. And while this does not fit very well with the biblical chronology, it fits in very well with the famine of Judea in AD 47. And therefore it fits in very well with the journey made by Saul from Edessa to Jerusalem in the time of Claudius. So the doctrine of Addai is being slightly disingenuous here, as most of these early documents are. It says that letters were being sent from King Agabus to Jesus in the time of Tiberius in order to suit the gospel chronology. But the governor at that time was Cassius Longinus, and so the actual date of this letter writing was AD 47. But the authors of these chronicles, including the ever deceitful Eusebius, could not admit to this late date, because it means that Jesus was writing letters to King Agabus of Edessa in AD 47. You see the problem here. This is the chronological chasm once more, which we talked about in previous lectures and talks. The entire chronology of these events, of the gospel events, has been shifted back by 40 years to distance the sort of saintly Jesus from the events of the Jewish revolt. This is the chronological chasm, and it pervades all of these texts. Even when we start looking at things like Arthurian legend, it pervades that text as well. So following this exchange of letters, apostles were sent from Jerusalem to Edessa to teach the Edessan people Judaism. And the first of these apostles was called Addai. Hence we have the name for the manuscript, the Doctrine of Addai. And this is an image of Addai from St. Catherine's Monastery, which lies at the foot of Mount Sinai. And most researchers identify Addai as the disciple Thaddeus. But who was Thaddeus? He's not one of the more famous disciples. Well, the Gospels say that he was called Lebbaeus, while the Thea lexicon of biblical Greek says, from a comparison with the catalogue of apostles in Luke and Acts, it seems that Judas, Lebbaeus, and Thaddeus were the same person. In addition, the Clementine recognitions say that Addai was Thomas, and it was Thomas who went to Edessa, not Addai Thaddeus. And so it's likely that this disciple's full name was Judas Thomas Didymus Lebbaeus Thaddeus Addai. You can see how we get multiple names for the same character within these texts, because a lot of these names are simply just translations into different languages. Thomas and Didymus, for instance, are the same name in Greek and Aramaic. And this Judas Thomas Didymus was probably the twin brother of Jesus, because both Thomas and Didymus mean the twin. And as an interesting aside, this might be why we have these apocryphal stories of Jesus going to India. They may have been relating the history of Jesus' twin brother, Judas Thomas Didymus Addai, who went to the east. Anyway, after much toing and froing between Jerusalem and Edessa, finally the Edessan monarchy are converted to Judaism. And the Talmud confirms this, as we've probably seen before. But the Talmud is much more specific, because it says that Queen Helena of Edessa converted to Nazarene Judaism, the same as Jesus was a Nazarene in Matthew 2:23. Okay, so what does all this have to do with the Jewish revolt? And what does it have to do with the discovery of Jesus in the historical record? Well, Josephus says the revolt was led by King Izates Monobazus of Adiabene. And now we know that this particular character was actually known as King Izates Monobazus of Edessa. He was an Edessan king. And now the revolt started in AD 66, so all we need to do is look at the Edessan king list for this time. And the king of Edessa in AD 66 is said to have been King Manu VI. And if we add Josephus's name to this, we get King Izates Manu VI of Edessa. But Josephus had a nickname for this king, a short name, and that was Jesus. And so perhaps his full name, that he would have been known as in many texts, was King Esus Manu VI of Edessa. And he became the de facto king of Judea in AD 66 because he was involved in the Jewish revolt. And this is interesting because now the secular name for the king of Judea was King Esus, but the biblical name for the king of Judea at this very same time was King Jesus. King Esus and King Jesus. And so it's likely that the name for the biblical Jesus actually came from the Persian Esus and not the Aramaic Joshua. And this is probably why Jesus is called Issa in Arabic, because Issa comes from Esus, not from Joshua. But of course, the biblical scribes could not admit that Jesus had a Persio-Parthian name, and so they invented a rather spurious link to the Aramaic name Joshua. In addition to this, Jesus also had another title, which is a little less known perhaps. And that comes from Matthew 1:23, which gives a prophecy. And the prophecy says, "Behold, a virgin shall be with child, and she will bring forth a son, and they will call his name Emmanuel," which means God with us. Which is a wonderful prophecy, except that nobody ever called Jesus Emmanuel. And so the prophecy that foretold the new Messiah was wrong. And so you might say the whole of the New Testament is meaningless because it was based upon a false prophecy. Or was it? Actually, it's possible that this is the final piece of this jigsaw puzzle. The piece that was only given to high initiates, the piece that provided illumination to the illuminated. And why do I say this? Well, it's because the full names and titles of these two kings of Judea are now King Esus Manu of Judea and Edessa, and King Jesus Emmanuel of Judea. So these two monarchs have the same name, King Esus Manu and King Jesus Emmanuel. And they were both involved in a revolt against Rome. And we've already proven that this was the Jewish revolt of AD 66 to 70. And Josephus Flavius says that King Esus Manu not only started and led the Jewish revolt, he was captured after the revolt ended. And he says of this, "The sons and brethren of King Isates besought Caesar to give them his right hand for their security. For the time being, Titus kept them all in custody and put the king's sons and kinsmen into chains and led them with him to Rome in order to make them hostages for their country's fidelity to the Romans." And in a very similar fashion, the biblical Jesus was captured and imprisoned. And the Gospels say of this, "And there was one named Barabbas, which lay bound with them, that had made revolution with Jesus, and who had committed murder in the revolution." So it's very, very similar to what Josephus is saying about the Edessan monarchs. But going back into the historical record, the record by Josephus Flavius, what happened to the Edessan king who was leading the Jewish revolt? Well, according to Josephus, he was crucified, which is most interesting indeed. And Josephus says of this, he says, "I was sent by Titus Caesar with 1,000 horsemen to a certain village called Tekoa. As I came back, I saw many captives being crucified and remembered 3 of them as my former acquaintances. So I immediately commanded them to be taken down and to have the greatest care taken of them in order to aid their recovery. Yet 2 of them died under the physician's hands, while the 3rd recovered. Interesting, isn't it? Now, before he changed sides, Saul Josephus had worked for the Edessan monarchy. Indeed, he had been the Edessan ambassador, as we've seen previously. So the former acquaintances of Josephus that he was talking about here had been the kings and princes of Edessa, the very people who he saw being crucified on his journey back from Tekoa. And yet Josephus arranged for them to be taken down early from the cross. But is this not the gospel crucifixion story, where the biblical Jesus was crucified alongside 2 others, but taken down early, and only one survived? Well, the Gospels say of this, there were 2 zealots crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. And those that passed by reviled him, saying, "You who destroyed the temple and builded it again in 3 days, save thyself. If thou be the Son of God, come down from the cross." So Jesus was crucified alongside 2 others, just as the Edessan king was crucified alongside 2 others. And Jesus here is being accused of destroying the temple. But when was the temple of Jerusalem destroyed? Well, it was destroyed after the Jewish revolt in AD 70, at the very time when those Edessan kings and princes were being crucified and then taken down early from the cross by Josephus. And remember also, this gets more and more interesting as it goes on, remember that Jesus was taken down early from the cross by Joseph of Arimathea. Now the Gospels say of this, Joseph of Arimathea went boldly unto Pilate and craved the body of Jesus. And Pilate marveled that he was already dead, and he gave the body to Josephus. This is Jesus being taken down from the cross, and Joseph of Arimathea is the character on the right, I think, with the turban. So King Jesus Emmanuel, the biblical Jesus, was taken down early from the cross by Joseph of Arimathea, while King Jesus Manu of Edessa was taken down early from the cross by Josephus Flavius. So is Joseph of Arimathea actually Josephus Flavius? Well, we'll see more evidence for this in later lectures. But more than that, the Gospels say that Jesus was crucified while wearing a plaited crown of thorns. And the Gospels say of this, and they clothed him with a purple robe and plaited a crown of thorns and put it about his head. And in a strikingly similar fashion, the Edessan kings always wore a purple robe and a crown of thorns. And here is the evidence. Here is a mosaic of the leader of the Jewish revolt from the Habakkuk mosaics in Galilee. We talked about these in Talk 1. And he was called Bar Kamza, the son of King Kamza, who we now know was King Jesus Emmanuel of Edessa, the leader of the Jewish revolt. And so this is a very early depiction of the biblical Jesus. And note that Bar Kamza, the biblical Jesus, is dressed as an Edessan monarch. He has the diadema headband, a symbol of royalty. You can see the tassels behind his neck there. He has ginger hair and a beard. He has a Jewish payot, the side lock of hair. He's wearing Roman armor. He's got stockings on, which is a Perso-Parthian tradition, and a purple cloak. So here is the purple cloak that was put upon the biblical Jesus at his crucifixion. And here is a coin of King Abgarus. Now this is a later Abgarus, but all of these monarchs wore the same regalia for over 2 centuries. And note that he wears a diadema headband. You can see them, the tassels behind his neck. And he also wears a plated crown of thorns, just as the biblical Jesus wore on the cross. So this is the famous crown of thorns. It was not a rustic twist of brambles. That was just a simple story for credulous believers. No, this was the traditional ceremonial crown of Edessa, which happened to be a crown of thorns. A crown that is full of ancient and esoteric symbolism, and we'll look at that symbolism again in a later lecture. So let's look at that biblical verse again. And it says, "And they clothed Jesus with a purple robe and a plaited crown of thorns." Yes, they clothed him as a king of Edessa, wearing a purple cloak of the emperor of Rome and an Edessan crown of thorns. And so this has to be the discovery of the century, or perhaps the millennia. We have at last found the biblical King Jesus in the historical record. He was King Esus Manu VI of Edessa, and he became the de facto king of the Jews in the late AD 60s. And he led the Nazarene revolt against the Romans, which is why he was jailed and crucified by the Romans. And so this identification gives us so much more information about the biblical Jesus. He is now a real historical figure, and we can visit his capital city, walk upon his citadel, collect his coins, and view his statues and mosaics. And here is just such an image. And we've already seen this mosaic. This is the Habakkuk mosaic, which just has to be of King Esus Manu, the biblical Jesus Emmanuel. But this mosaic is probably 3rd or 4th century, so a little bit later than the era of Jesus. However, there is an earlier image which is very similar to the Habakkuk mosaic, and this is known as the Palmyra Triad carving. And the central character in this trio is likely to be the leader of the Jewish revolt again. And so this is yet another image of the biblical Jesus. Now the 2 figures on either side are 2 gods. On the left we have Aglabol, the moon god, and on the right is Malakbel, the sun god. And note they have been deliberately made to look androgynous, and I'll explain why in a later lecture. But this carving is said to be from the 1st century, and so it is possibly contemporaneous with the life of Jesus. So this is what Jesus actually looked like. Note again the long hair and beard, which is why Jesus was always portrayed with long hair and a beard. But the similarities between the Palmyra carving and the Habakkuk mosaic continue. Note the diadema headband with the tassels behind, the same as on the Habakkuk mosaic. And then there is the Roman armour, and even the Perso-Parthian leggings that we talked about. And then there is the cloak fastened with a circular fibula, and no doubt that cloak was originally coloured purple once more. But do remember that only the Emperor of Rome was allowed to wear a purple cloak. Anyone else wearing one was effectively saying that they were the equal of the emperor, and that they were sort of sending out a signal of rebellion, which is why King Yuba I of Mauritania was executed for wearing one. And so now we know why these gospel events happened, and the full story goes something like this. In AD 4, the royal family of Queen Theomusa Aurania was exiled from Parthia and settled in Edessa, close to the Euphrates. And there they built a successful city-state, which was known as the Osrhoene, the kingdom of Edessa. And this was started off as a tax-free buffer state between Rome and Parthia. But Emperors Claudius and Nero tried to tax them, and this started a tax dispute with Rome. But moving on to AD 66, and it was quite obvious that Nero was a dead man walking, and he had no heirs. And so the throne of Rome would be open for whoever could take it. All you needed was a chest full of money and a loyal army. So King Esus Manu VI of Edessa started the Jewish revolt, not simply to take over Judea, but as a stepping stone to taking over the throne of Rome. He wanted to be Emperor Esus Manu of Rome, the first Eastern emperor of Rome. But Rome sent Vespasian to Judea to quell the revolt. And then we had the year of 4 emperors, where 3 emperors were deposed in 1 year. And that left 2 contenders in Judea in December AD 69. And they were King Esus Manu of Edessa and Commander Vespasian of Rome, who were fighting the Jewish revolt in Judea, not for the throne of Judea, but for the throne of Rome. Further evidence for this comes from the star prophecy, which said that a king from the east would become the new emperor of Rome. But remember, it was Jesus who was born under the eastern star, not Vespasian. And the Gospels say, "There came magi from the east, saying, 'Where is he that is born the King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and are come to worship him.'" So the star prophecy belonged to King Esus Jesus, the biblical Jesus, the king of Edessa, the king of the Jews. But Vespasian defeated King Esus Jesus during the Jewish revolt. And Josephus Flavius, and he says so himself, Josephus Flavius gave the star prophecy to Vespasian. And so Vespasian went back to Rome to become the next emperor. So we have a couple of misnomers here in the traditional history. The year of 4 emperors really should be the year of 5 emperors, with the 5th emperor being the aborted claim of King Esus Jesus of Edessa for the throne of Rome, the biblical Jesus. And the Jewish revolt was really the more like the Eastern Roman revolt. It had nothing much to do with Judea and everything to do with a power grab within the Roman Empire. It was more or less the same as the Battle of Bedriacum in Italy, where Vespasian's army defeated Emperor Vitellius in AD 69, and then Vespasian defeated Emperor Esus Jesus in AD 70 in Judea. The only difference between these 2 battles being that King Esus Jesus had not yet been to Rome to formalize his claim to be the new emperor. But he wore the purple cloak of an emperor, so it's pretty obvious what his true goals were. So that is the true story that the Gospels were trying to record. But what happened to the survivors of this Eastern Roman revolt? Well, as we've seen in one of the quotes before, they were taken to Rome. And in later lectures, we will explore the possibility that they were subsequently taken to Britain, to be as far from their power base in Judea as was possible within the Roman Empire. They were taken, I think, to Fortress Diwa, which is modern Chester in Britain. But we'll talk about that later. So this is the true story of the Gospels. It had nothing to do with a pauper Prince of Peace. a carpenter with charisma. It was actually a real secular history about the events of the Jewish revolt. But the story was neutered and sprinkled with fairy dust by Saul Josephus on the orders of Emperor Vespasian. And it was this that became the basis for a new religion, Saul Josephus's Judaism for Gentiles, or simple Judaism, or what we now call Christianity. So I hope you've enjoyed this illumination lecture, and you can join us again next time. Thank you.